Question 1. The evaluation methodology shows that an individual residing in Vermont wishes to obtain a non-resident pistol/revolver license in New Hampshire. Considering the specific regulatory framework of New Hampshire, which of the following actions best represents the most responsible and legally compliant approach for this applicant? Option A. Assume that the requirements for a non-resident license in New Hampshire are the same as those for obtaining a pistol/revolver license in Vermont, and proceed with the Vermont application process. Option B. Submit an application to New Hampshire with the information readily available, intending to provide any missing details if requested by the licensing authority. Option C. Thoroughly research the official New Hampshire State Police website and relevant New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA, to identify all specific application requirements, necessary documentation, any mandated training, and the correct submission procedures for non-residents. Option D. Rely on advice from online firearm enthusiast forums and friends who have obtained licenses in other states to gather information about the New Hampshire process. Correct answer is C. Thoroughly research the official New Hampshire State Police website and relevant New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA, to identify all specific application requirements, necessary documentation, any mandated training, and the correct submission procedures for non-residents. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that understanding the nuances of New Hampshire's non-resident pistol/revolver licensing requirements is crucial for responsible firearm ownership and legal compliance. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate specific state statutes and administrative rules that may differ significantly from their home state's regulations, potentially leading to unintentional violations if not thoroughly researched. The core of the challenge lies in accurately identifying and fulfilling all prerequisites without misinterpreting or overlooking any. The best approach involves proactively and meticulously gathering all necessary documentation and information directly from official New Hampshire sources. This includes understanding the specific application forms, residency verification requirements for non-residents, which often involve demonstrating a legitimate reason for needing a license in New Hampshire beyond mere convenience, any required training or safety courses mandated by New Hampshire law, and the correct submission process. This approach is correct because it aligns with the principle of due diligence and adherence to the letter of the law as stipulated by New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA, Chapter 159, and any relevant administrative rules. By consulting official sources, the applicant ensures they are working with the most current and accurate information, thereby minimizing the risk of application rejection or legal repercussions. An incorrect approach would be to assume that the licensing requirements are identical to those of the applicant's home state. This is a significant regulatory failure because New Hampshire has its own distinct set of laws governing firearm licensing, and reciprocity does not automatically equate to identical requirements. Relying on assumptions from another jurisdiction can lead to submitting incomplete or incorrect documentation, failing to meet specific training mandates, or misunderstanding the definition of non-resident as it applies to licensing in New Hampshire, all of which are grounds for denial. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on informal advice from friends or online forums without cross-referencing with official New Hampshire government websites or the New Hampshire State Police. While informal advice can sometimes be helpful, it is not a substitute for official guidance. This approach carries a high risk of misinformation, as laws and regulations can change, and informal sources may not be up to date or may misinterpret the nuances of the law. This can lead to procedural errors or the submission of invalid documentation, directly contravening the regulatory framework. A final incorrect approach would be to submit an application with incomplete information and hope for the best, or to assume that minor omissions will be overlooked. This demonstrates a lack of seriousness and respect for the legal process. New Hampshire's licensing process, like most governmental regulatory processes, requires a complete and accurate application. Incomplete applications are typically rejected outright, and this approach fails to meet the fundamental requirement of providing all necessary information as mandated by RSA 159. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes accuracy, thoroughness, and adherence to the specific legal framework of the jurisdiction in question. This involves identifying the governing statutes and regulations, consulting official sources for clarification, meticulously gathering all required documentation and ensuring all procedural steps are followed precisely. When in doubt, seeking clarification from the issuing authority, e.g., the New Hampshire State Police, is always the most prudent course of action. Question 2. Operational review demonstrates that an individual residing in Massachusetts is seeking a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license. Considering the specific requirements outlined in the New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA, Chapter 159, which of the following actions represents the most compliant and effective method for this applicant to pursue their license? Option A. Assume that because the applicant holds a valid pistol permit in Massachusetts, New Hampshire will automatically grant a non-resident license based on reciprocity. Option B. Rely on general online resources and forums discussing firearm licensing to gather information about the application process without consulting the official New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated. Option C. Submit the application and supporting documents to the local police department in the applicant's Massachusetts town of residence for processing and forwarding to New Hampshire authorities. Option D. Thoroughly review RSA Chapter 159, specifically RSA 159. 6. To understand the definition of a non-resident applicant, identify all required documentation, and submit the completed application with appropriate fees directly to the New Hampshire State Police. The correct answer is D. Thoroughly review RSA Chapter 159, specifically RSA 159. 6. To understand the definition of a non-resident applicant, identify all required documentation, and submit the completed application with appropriate fees directly to the New Hampshire State Police. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant for a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license to navigate the specific requirements of New Hampshire law while residing in another state. The core challenge lies in accurately interpreting and applying New Hampshire's statutory definitions and procedural mandates for non-residents, ensuring all documentation is compliant and submitted correctly to the appropriate New Hampshire authorities. Misinterpreting these requirements can lead to delays, denial of the license, or even potential legal repercussions if the applicant acts under a mistaken belief of qualification. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously reviewing the New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA, Chapter 159, specifically sections pertaining to pistol and revolver licenses for non-residents. This includes understanding the definition of non-resident, as it applies under RSA 159. 6. Identifying the required documentation such as proof of residency in their home state, completed application form, and any other supporting materials mandated by the New Hampshire State Police. The applicant must then ensure the application is submitted to the correct New Hampshire law enforcement agency or the state police, as specified by RSA 159. 6. And that all fees are paid. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the statutory framework established by New Hampshire law for non-resident licensing, minimizing the risk of error and ensuring a compliant application. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that a pistol/revolver license obtained in the applicant's home state automatically qualifies them for a non-resident license in New Hampshire. New Hampshire law does not grant automatic reciprocity for non-resident licenses based solely on possession of a license from another state. Each application is evaluated independently against New Hampshire's specific criteria. This failure to adhere to New Hampshire's statutory requirements is a significant regulatory failure. Another incorrect approach is to submit the application to the local police department in the applicant's home state, believing they can facilitate the New Hampshire license. New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA, Chapter 159, clearly designates the New Hampshire State Police or other designated New Hampshire law enforcement agencies as the recipients of such applications, not out-of-state agencies. This misdirection of the application constitutes a procedural and regulatory failure. A third incorrect approach is to rely on general information about firearm licensing without consulting the specific statutes of New Hampshire. This could lead to an incomplete application, missing required documentation, or misunderstanding the eligibility criteria, all of which would result in the application being rejected under RSA 159. 6. This is a failure to meet the specific legal mandates of the jurisdiction, Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic approach when dealing with licensing requirements in a specific jurisdiction. This involves 1. Identifying the governing statutes and regulations for the target jurisdiction, in this case, New Hampshire RSA Chapter 159. 2. Understanding the specific requirements for the applicant's status, non-resident. 3. Gathering all mandated documentation precisely as outlined in the law. 4. Submitting the application to the correct designated authority within the jurisdiction. 5. Verifying all information and fees before submission. This structured process ensures compliance and maximizes the likelihood of a successful outcome. Question 3. Benchmark analysis indicates that an applicant for a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license presents a valid pistol/revolver license from their home state, which is a state that has a recognized firearms safety course. What crucial step must be verified to ensure compliance with New Hampshire's licensing requirements for non-residents? Option A. Verifying that the applicant's home state license is current and has no disciplinary actions recorded against it. Option B. Ensuring the applicant has resided in their home state for a minimum of 1 year prior to applying for the New Hampshire license. Option C. Confirming that the applicant's home state has a reciprocal licensing agreement with New Hampshire and that their firearms safety course meets New Hampshire's recognized standards. Option D. Checking if the applicant has a clean criminal record in their home state and any states where they have previously resided. The correct answer is C. Confirming that the applicant's home state has a reciprocal licensing agreement with New Hampshire and that their firearms safety course meets New Hampshire's recognized standards. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant for a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license to navigate the specific requirements of New Hampshire law while potentially being subject to the laws of their home state. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to New Hampshire's statutory requirements for non-resident licenses can lead to denial, legal complications, and a failure to uphold the integrity of the licensing process. Careful judgment is required to ensure all conditions are met precisely as stipulated by New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves diligently verifying that the applicant meets all the explicit criteria outlined in RSA 159.6 for non-resident pistol/revolver licenses. This includes ensuring the applicant possesses a valid pistol/revolver license issued by their state of residence, that their home state has a reciprocal licensing agreement with New Hampshire, and that they have completed a firearms safety course that is recognized by New Hampshire standards. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the statutory requirements for non-residents seeking a license in New Hampshire, ensuring compliance with RSA 159.6. Incorrect approach is analysis. Failing to confirm the existence of a reciprocal licensing agreement between New Hampshire and the applicant's home state is a regulatory failure. RSA 159.6 specifically mandates this reciprocity for non-resident licenses. Without this, the applicant cannot qualify under New Hampshire law. Assuming that a valid pistol/revolver license from any state automatically qualifies an applicant for New Hampshire non-resident license is a significant regulatory misinterpretation. New Hampshire law is specific about the requirements for non-residents, and simply holding a license elsewhere is insufficient if the home state does not meet the reciprocity or other stipulated conditions. Overlooking the requirement for a firearms safety course recognized by New Hampshire standards is another regulatory failure. RSA 159.6 outlines the necessity of such training, and a course from another jurisdiction may not meet the specific criteria established by New Hampshire law. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes strict adherence to the letter of the law. This involves 1. Identifying the specific statutory provisions governing the application, in this case, RSA 159.6 for non-residents. 2. Systematically checking each requirement against the applicant's documentation and circumstances. 3. Seeking clarification from official sources, e.g., the New Hampshire State Police, if any ambiguity exists. 4. Documenting the verification process thoroughly. This methodical approach ensures all legal obligations are met and prevents the issuance of licenses to individuals who do not meet the state's safety and legal standards. Question 4. The evaluation methodology shows that when processing a non-resident pistol/revolver license application in New Hampshire, What is the most critical step to ensure compliance with state law and public safety? Option A. Accepting the application based on the applicant's assurance that they are a responsible gun owner and have no intention of using the firearm unlawfully. Option B. Relying on general knowledge of firearm laws without consulting the most recent New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA, pertaining to non-resident permits. Option C. Verifying the applicant's valid out-of-state pistol/revolver license or permit, confirming their residency in their home state, and cross-referencing their information against New Hampshire's statutory disqualifiers for firearm possession. Option D. Issuing the license promptly after a brief interview, assuming that if they were able to obtain a license in their home state, they are likely eligible in New Hampshire. The correct answer is C. Verifying the applicant's valid out-of-state pistol/revolver license or permit, confirming their residency in their home state, and cross-referencing their information against New Hampshire's statutory disqualifiers for firearm possession. Explanation: the evaluation methodology shows that processing a non-resident pistol/revolver license application in New Hampshire requires meticulous adherence to specific statutory requirements and a thorough understanding of the applicant's background. The professional challenge lies in balancing the state's interest in public safety with the applicant's Second Amendment rights, necessitating a careful review of all submitted documentation and a clear understanding of disqualifying factors as defined by New Hampshire law. A failure to properly assess these factors could lead to the issuance of a license to an individual who poses a risk, or conversely, the unwarranted denial of a lawful application. The best approach involves a comprehensive review of the applicant's submitted application, including verification of their out-of-state pistol/revolver license or permit, confirmation of their residency status in their home state, and a thorough check against New Hampshire's disqualifying criteria for firearm possession. This aligns with RSA 159, 8A, which outlines the requirements for non-resident permits and the grounds for denial, ensuring that only eligible individuals receive a license. This method prioritizes public safety by strictly following the established legal framework for non-resident licensing, an approach that focuses solely on the applicant's stated intent for owning a firearm without verifying their out-of-state credentials or checking for disqualifying factors is procedurally flawed. It overlooks the statutory mandate to confirm the applicant's eligibility based on their home state's licensing status and New Hampshire's specific prohibitions, potentially leading to the issuance of a license to an unqualified individual. Another unacceptable approach would be to grant the license based on a personal acquaintance or a perceived lack of threat from the applicant, disregarding the formal application process and the legal requirements. This introduces subjective bias and bypasses the objective criteria established by New Hampshire law, such as criminal history or mental health adjudications, which are critical for determining eligibility and ensuring public safety. Finally, an approach that relies on outdated or incomplete information regarding New Hampshire's firearm laws would be detrimental. The licensing authority must be current with all statutory amendments and interpretations to make informed decisions that are both legally sound and ethically responsible. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that emphasizes due diligence, strict adherence to statutory requirements, and objective assessment of all submitted evidence. This involves a systematic review process that cross-references applicant information with legal disqualifiers and verifies all necessary documentation as mandated by New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated RSA. Question 5. Strategic planning requires a financial advisor in Massachusetts to assist a client who is seeking to obtain a non-resident pistol/revolver license in New Hampshire. Which of the following actions best represents a compliant and professionally responsible approach to advising the client? Option A. Inform the client that pistol/revolver licensing requirements are generally similar across all states and proceed with advising them based on Massachusetts licensing procedures. Option B. Advise the client to research and adhere strictly to New Hampshire's specific statutes and administrative rules for non-resident pistol/revolver licenses, ensuring all application materials are accurate and complete, and recommending direct consultation with New Hampshire authorities for definitive guidance. Option C. Suggest to the client that firearm licensing is a minor administrative matter, and they can likely proceed with their application without needing to meticulously verify every detail of New Hampshire's specific requirements. Option D. Recommend the client apply for the New Hampshire license using the application forms and procedures typically used for obtaining a license in Vermont, as it is a neighboring state. The correct answer is B. Advise the client to research and adhere strictly to New Hampshire's specific statutes and administrative rules for non-resident pistol/revolver licenses, ensuring all application materials are accurate and complete, and recommending direct consultation with New Hampshire authorities for definitive guidance. Explanation: strategic planning requires careful consideration of all applicable laws and regulations when advising clients. In New Hampshire, obtaining a non-resident pistol/revolver license involves specific requirements that must be met to ensure compliance. This scenario is professionally challenging because a financial advisor must navigate the complexities of New Hampshire's licensing laws while also upholding their fiduciary duty to their client, ensuring the client's actions are legal and do not expose them to unnecessary risk. Misinterpreting or overlooking these requirements can lead to significant legal repercussions for both the client and the advisor. The best professional approach involves thoroughly researching and understanding New Hampshire's specific requirements for non-resident pistol/revolver licenses. This includes identifying the relevant state statutes and administrative rules governing the application process, eligibility criteria, and any reciprocity agreements with the applicant's home state. The advisor should then guide the client through these requirements, ensuring all documentation is accurate and submitted correctly, and advising the client to consult directly with the New Hampshire State Police or other designated licensing authority for definitive guidance. This approach is correct because it prioritizes legal compliance and client protection. By adhering strictly to the established regulatory framework of New Hampshire, it demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to providing accurate, actionable advice based on the specific jurisdiction's laws. An incorrect approach would be to assume that licensing requirements are uniform across all states and to provide general advice without verifying New Hampshire's specific regulations. This fails to acknowledge the unique legal landscape of New Hampshire and could lead the client to believe they have met all requirements when they have not, potentially resulting in an invalid application or legal penalties. Another incorrect approach is to advise the client to proceed with the application based on information from another state's licensing process. This is a direct violation of the principle of jurisdictional specificity and ignores the fact that each state has its own distinct laws and procedures. Relying on information from a different jurisdiction is not only inaccurate, but also demonstrates a lack of professional diligence. A further incorrect approach would be to dismiss the licensing requirements as a minor administrative detail and encourage the client to proceed without full compliance, perhaps suggesting they can address any issues later. This is ethically unsound and legally perilous, as it disregards the importance of adhering to all legal prerequisites for firearm ownership and licensing. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the specific jurisdiction and the relevant legal and regulatory framework. This is followed by a comprehensive research phase to understand all applicable requirements. The next step involves clear communication with the client, outlining the necessary steps and potential pitfalls. Finally, professionals should always recommend that clients seek direct confirmation from the relevant governmental authorities when dealing with licensing and legal compliance matters. Question 6. The performance metrics show a significant number of non-resident pistol/revolver license applications from individuals residing in states with varying firearm regulations. Considering an applicant from Massachusetts seeking a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license, which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with New Hampshire law? Option A. Verifying the applicant's Massachusetts FID card status and ensuring they are not disqualified under New Hampshire's RSA 159, then completing the New Hampshire application with all required documentation. Option B. Relying on general reciprocity agreements between states without confirming New Hampshire's specific requirements for Massachusetts residents. Option C. Assuming that because Massachusetts has firearm regulation, the applicant is automatically eligible for a New Hampshire non-resident license. Option D. Submitting the application with only the applicant's Massachusetts address, assuming New Hampshire will verify their home state eligibility independently. The correct answer is A. verifying the applicant's Massachusetts FID card status and ensuring they are not disqualified under New Hampshire's RSA 159, then completing the New Hampshire application with all required documentation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant for a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license to navigate the specific requirements for out-of-state residents, which often involve verifying their home state's licensing status and ensuring compliance with both New Hampshire and their home state's laws. Misinterpreting or overlooking these nuances can lead to denial of the application or, worse, legal complications. Careful judgment is required to ensure all documentation is accurate and all legal prerequisites are met. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves thoroughly researching and adhering to New Hampshire's specific statutory requirements for non-resident pistol/revolver license applicants, as outlined in RSA 159. This includes understanding that New Hampshire generally issues permits to non-residents if they are legally permitted to possess a handgun in their state of residence and are not disqualified under New Hampshire law. The applicant must provide proof of their home state's eligibility and comply with any specific application procedures mandated by New Hampshire, such as submitting fingerprints and undergoing a background check. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal framework governing non-resident licensing in New Hampshire, ensuring compliance with RSA 159 and preventing potential legal issues. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that focuses solely on obtaining a pistol/revolver license in the applicant's home state without verifying New Hampshire's specific non-resident requirements is professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge that New Hampshire has its own set of criteria for issuing licenses to individuals from other states, and simply having a license elsewhere does not automatically qualify an applicant in New Hampshire. This approach risks an application denial due to non-compliance with state-specific statutes. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to assume that because New Hampshire has reciprocity with some states, all states are covered, and therefore no specific verification of home state eligibility is needed for a non-resident application. This is incorrect because reciprocity agreements are specific and may not apply to all aspects of licensing or to all states. The applicant must still demonstrate they meet New Hampshire's criteria for non-residents, which includes being legally permitted to possess a handgun in their home state. Finally, an approach that involves submitting an incomplete application with missing documentation, such as proof of home state eligibility or required background check information, is professionally unsound. This directly violates the procedural requirements for obtaining a license in New Hampshire, as stipulated by RSA 159, and will almost certainly result in the application being rejected. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making framework when assisting clients with non-resident licensing. This involves 1. Identifying the specific jurisdiction's laws, New Hampshire in this case, and the applicant's home state laws. 2. Determining the applicant's eligibility under both sets of laws. 3. Gathering all required documentation as specified by the target jurisdiction. 4. Submitting a complete and accurate application. 5. Staying informed about any changes in relevant legislation. This structured approach ensures all legal and procedural requirements are met, minimizing the risk of application denial or legal repercussions. Question 7. The evaluation methodology shows that when reviewing a non-resident pistol/revolver license application in New Hampshire, an applicant presents a valid pistol/revolver license issued by the state of Vermont. What is the most appropriate course of action for the New Hampshire Licensing Authority to ensure compliance with RSA 159? Option A. Immediately approve the New Hampshire non-resident license based on the reciprocity established by the valid Vermont license, assuming all Vermont requirements are equivalent to New Hampshire's. Option B. Accept the Vermont license as conclusive proof of eligibility for a New Hampshire non-resident license, without further investigation into the applicant's background or the license's validity. Option C. Verify the validity and current status of the Vermont pistol/revolver license and confirm that the applicant meets all New Hampshire eligibility requirements as outlined in RSA 159, independent of their Vermont license. Option D. Deny the application because Vermont's licensing process may differ from New Hampshire's, and therefore, reciprocity cannot be assumed without a full reapplication process. The correct answer is C. Verify the validity and current status of the Vermont pistol/revolver license and confirm that the applicant meets all New Hampshire eligibility requirements as outlined in RSA 159, independent of their Vermont license. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that processing a non-resident pistol/revolver license application in New Hampshire requires a meticulous understanding of RSA 159 and its associated administrative rules, particularly concerning the verification of out-of-state permits and the applicant's eligibility. The professional challenge lies in balancing the state's interest in public safety with the rights of individuals to possess firearms, while ensuring strict adherence to legal requirements. Misinterpreting or overlooking any part of the process can lead to the issuance of a license to an ineligible individual or the undue denial of a legitimate application. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the applicant's submitted documentation, including their out-of-state pistol/revolver license, to confirm its validity and reciprocity status with New Hampshire. This includes verifying that the applicant meets all the eligibility criteria outlined in RSA 159, such as age and the absence of disqualifying criminal convictions or mental health adjudications. The applicant's out-of-state license serves as prima facie evidence of their eligibility in their home state, which New Hampshire law, specifically RSA 159(11), allows for consideration. However, the New Hampshire Licensing Authority retains the ultimate responsibility to ensure the applicant meets all New Hampshire requirements. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the statutory mandate to verify eligibility and ensure public safety through diligent application review, respecting the reciprocity provisions while upholding state-specific standards. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the existence of an out-of-state license without independently verifying the applicant's eligibility under New Hampshire law. This fails to acknowledge that reciprocity does not equate to automatic qualification. The applicant must still meet New Hampshire's specific criteria. Another incorrect approach would be to deny the application solely because the applicant's home state has different licensing procedures, without first determining if the applicant meets New Hampshire's substantive eligibility requirements. This disregards the reciprocity provisions intended to facilitate licensing for eligible individuals from other states. Finally, approving the application without confirming the validity and current status of the out-of-state license would be a significant regulatory failure, potentially issuing a license to someone who is no longer legally permitted to carry a firearm in their home state, thereby compromising public safety. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes statutory compliance, thorough documentation review, and a commitment to public safety. This involves a systematic checklist approach to ensure all statutory requirements of RSA 159 are met, including verification of out-of-state credentials and independent confirmation of eligibility criteria. When in doubt, seeking clarification from legal counsel or supervisory personnel is paramount. Question 8. Regulatory review indicates an individual holds a valid New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license and wishes to apply for a non-resident pistol/revolver license in Vermont. Considering the distinct legal frameworks of each state, what is the most prudent course of action to ensure a successful application in Vermont? Option A. Submit the New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license along with a general statement of eligibility, assuming Vermont will recognize its validity. Option B. Rely on general knowledge of firearm regulations and assume Vermont's requirements will be similar to New Hampshire's. Option C. Contact Vermont authorities and request they review New Hampshire's licensing process to determine if it meets their standards. Option D. Thoroughly research and comply with all specific application requirements, documentation, and eligibility criteria as outlined in Vermont statutes for non-resident pistol/revolver licenses. The correct answer is D. Thoroughly research and comply with all specific application requirements, documentation, and eligibility criteria as outlined in Vermont statutes for non-resident pistol/revolver licenses. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a New Hampshire resident applying for a non-resident pistol/revolver license in Vermont. The core difficulty lies in navigating the differing requirements and potential conflicts between the applicant's home state licensing status and the destination state's application process. Ensuring compliance with both sets of regulations, particularly regarding the definition of eligible and the process for out-of-state applicants, requires meticulous attention to detail and a thorough understanding of Vermont's specific statutes. Misinterpreting or overlooking any requirement could lead to a denial of the application, potential legal repercussions, or even the invalidation of an issued license. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves proactively identifying and adhering to Vermont's specific statutory requirements for non-resident pistol/revolver license applications. This means consulting Vermont's firearm laws, specifically those pertaining to non-resident permits, and ensuring all documentation and prerequisites align with Vermont's standards, even if they differ from New Hampshire's. This approach is correct because Vermont law governs the issuance of licenses within its borders. While New Hampshire's license is a prerequisite for residency, Vermont's application process is independent and must be satisfied on its own terms. This demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to legal compliance within the jurisdiction where the license is sought. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that holding a valid New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license automatically satisfies all Vermont requirements for a non-resident permit. This is a regulatory failure because Vermont has its own distinct application procedures, eligibility criteria, and potentially different documentation requirements for non-residents seeking a license to carry in their state. Simply presenting the New Hampshire license without fulfilling Vermont's specific application process would be insufficient and likely lead to denial. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on general knowledge of firearm laws without consulting Vermont's specific statutes for non-resident permits. This is an ethical and regulatory failure because it introduces a high risk of overlooking critical, jurisdiction-specific nuances. General knowledge is not a substitute for the precise legal framework of Vermont, which dictates the exact steps and qualifications for obtaining a non-resident license. A further incorrect approach is to submit an application based on the assumption that Vermont will automatically recognize New Hampshire's licensing standards without verification. This is a professional oversight and a potential regulatory violation. Each state has the authority to set its own standards for firearm permits, and reciprocity does not equate to automatic acceptance of another state's licensing process as a complete substitute for their own. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes jurisdiction-specific research and compliance. The process should begin with identifying the target jurisdiction, Vermont, and thoroughly researching its specific statutes and regulations pertaining to non-resident pistol/revolver licenses. This includes understanding application procedures, required documentation, eligibility criteria, and any reciprocity agreements or lack thereof. The next step is to compare these requirements with the applicant's current status and documentation. Any discrepancies must be addressed by fulfilling Vermont's specific mandates. Finally, the application should be submitted with absolute certainty that all Vermont requirements have been met, ensuring legal and ethical compliance. Question 9. Performance analysis shows that an applicant seeking a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license has submitted an application that includes documentation primarily reflecting the licensing requirements of their home state, with minimal attention paid to New Hampshire's specific statutes. Which of the following approaches best reflects the necessary steps for a compliant application under New Hampshire law? Option A. The applicant must meticulously review and adhere to all requirements outlined in the New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA, Chapter 159, ensuring all submitted documentation, including proof of residency and any required background checks, specifically meets New Hampshire's standards for non-residents. Option B. The applicant may submit an application with some missing information, believing that the New Hampshire State Police will contact them for clarification if necessary. Option C. The applicant should rely on general firearm safety knowledge and common licensing practices, as New Hampshire's requirements are likely to be similar to other states. Option D. The applicant can assume that if their home state's pistol/revolver license requirements are met, New Hampshire will automatically approve their non-resident application due to reciprocity. The correct answer is A. The applicant must meticulously review and adhere to all requirements outlined in the New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA, Chapter 159, ensuring all submitted documentation, including proof of residency and any required background checks, specifically meets New Hampshire's standards for non-residents. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant for a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license to navigate the specific requirements of New Hampshire law while also being aware of their home state's regulations. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to either jurisdiction's rules can lead to denial of the license, potential legal repercussions, and a loss of trust in the licensing process. Careful judgment is required to ensure all documentation is accurate, complete, and compliant with New Hampshire's statutes. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves thoroughly researching and understanding New Hampshire's specific requirements for non-resident pistol/revolver licenses, including any reciprocity agreements or specific documentation needed from the applicant's state of residence. This approach ensures that the application is complete and accurate according to New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA 159, particularly concerning the qualifications and application process for non-residents. Adhering strictly to these state-specific requirements, such as providing proof of non-residency and completing the application form accurately, is paramount for a successful application. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that the licensing requirements of the applicant's home state are sufficient for New Hampshire. This fails to recognize that New Hampshire has its own distinct set of laws governing firearm licenses, and simply meeting the standards of another jurisdiction does not automatically satisfy New Hampshire's criteria. This approach risks submitting an incomplete or non-compliant application, leading to denial. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on general knowledge of firearm laws without consulting the specific statutes and administrative rules of New Hampshire. This can lead to overlooking crucial details or misinterpreting the intent of RSA 159, such as specific residency verification methods or the types of disqualifying factors unique to New Hampshire. A further incorrect approach is to submit an application with incomplete or inaccurate personal information, hoping it will be overlooked. New Hampshire law requires accurate and truthful information on all licensing applications. Any misrepresentation or omission can be grounds for denial and may have further legal consequences. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making framework when assisting applicants with licensing. This involves 1. Identifying the specific jurisdiction and the relevant licensing authority, New Hampshire State Police in this case. 2. Thoroughly researching the applicable statutes and regulations, RSA 159, and related administrative rules. 3. Gathering all required documentation, ensuring it meets the specific criteria of the target jurisdiction. 4. Verifying the applicant's eligibility based on the identified regulations. 5. Submitting a complete and accurate application. This structured approach minimizes errors and ensures compliance. Question 10. Quality control measures reveal a discrepancy in fee collection for a non-resident pistol/revolver license application processed in New Hampshire. A firearms dealer collected a total of $60,000 for an applicant. Based on New Hampshire RSA 159, 6, the application fee is $40,000 and the required background check fee is $25,000. What is the correct total fee that should have been collected from the non-resident applicant? Option A, $50,000. Option B, $65,000. Option C, $40,000. Option D, $85,000. Correct answer is B, $65,000. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a New Hampshire licensed firearms dealer because it involves a direct financial transaction with a non-resident applicant for a pistol/revolver license. The core challenge lies in accurately calculating the required fees and ensuring compliance with New Hampshire's specific statutory requirements for non-resident licensing, which may differ from resident requirements or general federal regulations. Miscalculation or misunderstanding of these fees can lead to financial loss for the applicant, regulatory scrutiny for the dealer, and potential delays or denial of the license, impacting the applicant's rights and the dealer's reputation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously calculating the total fee based on the sum of the application fee and the required background check fee, as stipulated by New Hampshire RSA 159, 6. This approach ensures that the applicant is charged the precise amount mandated by state law, preventing undercharging, which would be a financial loss and potential regulatory issue for the dealer, or overcharging, which would be an unfair burden on the applicant. Adhering strictly to the statutory fee structure demonstrates due diligence and upholds the integrity of the licensing process. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves only charging the base application fee without including the separate fee for the criminal background check. This fails to comply with New Hampshire RSA 159(6), which explicitly requires both fees to be collected for processing a non-resident pistol/revolver license application. This would result in the dealer absorbing the cost of the background check or the application being incomplete, leading to potential penalties or rejection by the licensing authority. Another incorrect approach is to estimate the total fee based on a general understanding of firearm licensing costs without consulting the specific New Hampshire statutes. This could lead to overcharging the applicant, which is unethical and potentially illegal, as it constitutes an unauthorized fee. It also fails to meet the precise statutory requirements, risking regulatory action against the dealer. A third incorrect approach is to apply the fee structure for a New Hampshire resident license to a non-resident applicant. New Hampshire RSA 159(6) outlines specific provisions for non-residents, which may include different or additional fees compared to residents. Failing to differentiate can lead to incorrect fee collection and non-compliance with the distinct requirements for non-resident applicants. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this situation by first identifying the specific New Hampshire statute governing non-resident pistol/revolver licenses, RSA 159(6). They should then break down the required fees as itemized in the statute. A clear calculation should be performed, summing all mandated fees. If any ambiguity exists, consulting the relevant New Hampshire state agency or legal counsel is advisable before collecting payment. This systematic approach ensures accuracy, compliance, and ethical conduct. Question 11. The monitoring system demonstrates an applicant for a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license has provided a Massachusetts address and indicated an intent to carry a firearm in New Hampshire. What is the most appropriate next step for the licensing authority to ensure compliance with New Hampshire law? Option A. Deny the New Hampshire non-resident license, assuming that Massachusetts residents are not eligible for such permits. Option B. Approve the New Hampshire non-resident license, but flag the application for a follow-up review to confirm the applicant's Massachusetts residency status. Option C. Verify the applicant possesses a valid pistol/revolver license issued by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and ensure the New Hampshire application is complete and accurate according to RSA 159(6). Option D. Immediately approve the New Hampshire non-resident license, as the applicant has provided a Massachusetts address and stated intent to carry in New Hampshire. The correct answer is C. Verify the applicant possesses a valid pistol/revolver license issued by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and ensure the New Hampshire application is complete and accurate according to RSA 159(6). Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates a potential issue with a non-resident pistol/revolver license application in New Hampshire. The challenge lies in discerning whether the applicant's stated residency in Massachusetts, coupled with their intent to carry a pistol or revolver in New Hampshire, meets the specific requirements for a non-resident license under New Hampshire law. This scenario requires careful judgment to ensure compliance with both New Hampshire's licensing statutes and the principle of reciprocity, while also respecting the licensing authority of other states. The best approach involves a thorough review of the applicant's documentation against New Hampshire's statutory definition of a non-resident for the purposes of firearm licensing. This includes verifying that the applicant is a legal resident of Massachusetts and that their stated purpose for seeking a New Hampshire license is legitimate and does not circumvent Massachusetts' own firearm laws. New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA 159(6) outlines the requirements for non-resident permits, emphasizing that the applicant must be a resident of another state and possess a valid permit from their home state. The correct approach is to confirm that the applicant possesses a valid Massachusetts pistol permit and that their application for a New Hampshire non-resident license is complete and accurate according to RSA 159(6). This ensures adherence to the specific provisions for non-residents and respects the licensing authority of the applicant's home state. An incorrect approach would be to immediately approve the license based solely on the applicant stating they are a Massachusetts resident and intend to carry in New Hampshire. This fails to verify the critical requirement of possessing a valid permit from their home state, which is a prerequisite under RSA 159(6). Another incorrect approach is to deny the license without a thorough review, perhaps based on a misunderstanding of non-resident provisions or an assumption that Massachusetts residents are ineligible. This could lead to an arbitrary denial and potential legal challenge. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to approve the license without confirming the completeness and accuracy of the application, potentially overlooking crucial details that could impact the validity of the permit. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes statutory compliance and due diligence. This involves 1. Identifying the relevant jurisdiction's laws, New Hampshire RSA 159(6). 2. Understanding the specific requirements for the applicant's status, non-resident. 3. Verifying all submitted documentation against these requirements. 4. Consulting with supervisors or legal counsel if ambiguities arise. 5. Making a decision based on established legal criteria, not assumptions or personal biases. Question 12. Stakeholder feedback indicates a common point of confusion for non-residents applying for a pistol/revolver license in New Hampshire. An individual residing in Vermont, who holds a valid pistol permit issued by Vermont, wishes to obtain a New Hampshire non-resident license. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with New Hampshire's firearm licensing regulations? Option A. Rely on advice from a friend who previously obtained a New Hampshire license as a resident to complete the application process for a non-resident permit. Option B. Thoroughly review New Hampshire statutes regarding non-resident pistol/revolver licenses, specifically RSA 159(6), and gather all required documentation, including proof of Vermont residency and any mandated firearm safety course completion recognized by New Hampshire, to submit a complete application. Option C. Assume that a valid Vermont pistol permit automatically qualifies them for a New Hampshire non-resident license due to reciprocity. Option D. Submit the Vermont pistol permit and a basic application form, believing that this is sufficient for a non-resident license in New Hampshire. The correct answer is B. Thoroughly review New Hampshire statutes regarding non-resident pistol/revolver licenses, specifically RSA 159(6), and gather all required documentation, including proof of Vermont residency and any mandated firearm safety course completion recognized by New Hampshire, to submit a complete application. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the specific requirements for a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license, while also demonstrating a clear understanding of the legal and ethical responsibilities associated with firearm ownership. The challenge lies in accurately interpreting and applying New Hampshire statutes to a situation where the applicant's primary residence is outside the state, necessitating a thorough understanding of reciprocity and the specific documentation required for non-residents. Misinterpreting these requirements could lead to a denial of the license, potential legal repercussions, or a failure to meet the standards expected of a responsible firearm owner in New Hampshire. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously reviewing the New Hampshire statutes pertaining to pistol and revolver licenses for non-residents, specifically focusing on RSA 159(6) and any associated administrative rules. This approach requires the applicant to identify and gather all necessary documentation, which typically includes proof of residency in their home state, a completed application form, and potentially a certificate of completion for a firearm safety course recognized by New Hampshire. Furthermore, it necessitates understanding any reciprocity agreements between New Hampshire and the applicant's home state. This thorough and compliant approach ensures that the application meets all legal prerequisites, demonstrating due diligence and respect for New Hampshire's firearm laws. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that a valid pistol permit from another state automatically grants eligibility for a New Hampshire non-resident license without verifying specific New Hampshire requirements. This fails to acknowledge that licensing is state-specific and that New Hampshire has its own distinct statutory framework, RSA 159(6). that must be satisfied, regardless of out-of-state permits. Another incorrect approach is to submit an incomplete application, omitting required documentation such as proof of residency in the applicant's home state, or failing to provide evidence of firearm safety training if mandated for non-residents. This demonstrates a lack of attention to detail and a disregard for the explicit requirements outlined in New Hampshire law, leading to a likely denial. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on informal advice from online forums or individuals without consulting the official New Hampshire statutes or relevant state agencies. This can lead to misinformation and a failure to comply with the precise legal obligations, potentially resulting in a flawed application and a negative outcome. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic decision-making framework when dealing with licensing requirements. This involves 1. Identifying the specific jurisdiction and the relevant regulatory body, New Hampshire State Police for firearm permits. 2. Thoroughly researching the applicable statutes and administrative rules, RSA 159-6. 3. Identifying all required documentation and eligibility criteria for the specific applicant type, non-resident. 4. Consulting official sources for clarification if any ambiguity exists. 5. Completing the application accurately and submitting all required supporting materials. This structured approach ensures compliance, minimizes risk, and promotes responsible conduct. Question 13. The evaluation methodology shows that a New Hampshire resident is processing a non-resident pistol/revolver license application. The applicant has provided all standard application forms and a pistol permit from their home state of Vermont, which appears to be valid. However, the applicant's criminal history check reveals a misdemeanor conviction for simple assault that occurred 5 years ago in Vermont. What is the most appropriate course of action for the New Hampshire Licensing Authority? Option A. Request additional documentation from the applicant regarding the specifics of the Vermont misdemeanor conviction and its legal implications in Vermont, without independently verifying New Hampshire's statutory grounds for disqualification. Option B. Approve the application based on the applicant's valid Vermont permit, assuming reciprocity and that Vermont's licensing standards are equivalent to New Hampshire's. Option C. Deny the application immediately due to the applicant's prior misdemeanor conviction, assuming any criminal record automatically disqualifies an applicant for a firearm license. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA 159, to determine if the Vermont misdemeanor conviction legally disqualifies the applicant from obtaining a non-resident pistol/revolver license, and if not, proceed with the application after verifying the Vermont permit's validity and the applicant's eligibility under other RSA 159 provisions. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA 159, to determine if the Vermont misdemeanor conviction legally disqualifies the applicant from obtaining a non-resident pistol/revolver license, and if not, proceed with the application after verifying the Vermont permit's validity and the applicant's eligibility under other RSA 159 provisions. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that processing a non-resident pistol/revolver license application in New Hampshire requires a meticulous adherence to specific statutory requirements and a thorough vetting process. The professional challenge lies in balancing the applicant's right to apply with the state's compelling interest in public safety and responsible firearm ownership. Misinterpreting or overlooking any detail can lead to either the improper issuance of a license to an unqualified individual or the unjust denial of a legitimate application, both carrying significant legal and ethical ramifications. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of all submitted documentation against the criteria outlined in New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA 159, specifically focusing on sections pertaining to the eligibility of non-residents. This includes verifying the applicant's residency status in their home state, confirming they meet the age requirements, and ensuring they have not been disqualified by any state or federal law prohibiting firearm possession. A thorough background check, including criminal history and mental health records where permissible and relevant, is paramount. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the legislative intent of RSA 159, which is to ensure that only law-abiding citizens who meet specific qualifications are granted the privilege of carrying a pistol or revolver in New Hampshire. Statute mandates a diligent inquiry into an applicant's background to safeguard public safety. An incorrect approach would be to approve the application solely based on the applicant's assertion of meeting all requirements without independent verification. This fails to uphold the duty to conduct a thorough background check, as implicitly required by the licensing statute and the state's interest in public safety. Another incorrect approach would be to deny the application based on a personal bias or a misunderstanding of the statutory grounds for disqualification, such as a minor, non-violent offense that does not legally prohibit firearm possession under RSA 159. This constitutes an arbitrary and capricious denial, violating the applicant's rights and the principles of due process. Lastly, relying on outdated or incomplete information from the applicant's home state without attempting to obtain current, verifiable data would also be an unacceptable failure in due diligence. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes statutory compliance, thoroughness, and fairness. This involves establishing clear internal procedures for application review, cross-referencing information from multiple reliable sources, and seeking clarification from legal counsel or supervisory personnel when encountering ambiguous situations. The process should be objective, evidence-based, and consistently applied to all applicants. Question 14. The assessment process reveals an applicant for a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license has disclosed a prior arrest for simple assault that was subsequently dismissed by the court. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework for evaluating such an application? Option A. Deny the license application based on a personal assessment that any arrest, even if dismissed, suggests a potential risk to public safety. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the dismissed simple assault charge and the applicant's overall background to determine if the circumstances of the arrest and dismissal, when considered against New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated RSA 159-6, indicate a disqualifying factor for licensing. Option C. Overlook the disclosed simple assault arrest and dismissal, proceeding with the license approval based on the absence of a conviction. Option D. Automatically deny the license application due to the presence of a prior arrest for simple assault, irrespective of the dismissal. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough review of the dismissed simple assault charge and the applicant's overall background to determine if the circumstances of the arrest and dismissal, when considered against New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated RSA 159-6, indicate a disqualifying factor for licensing. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario where an applicant for a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license has a prior arrest for simple assault that was ultimately dismissed. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires careful judgment to balance the applicant's right to privacy and the state's interest in public safety. The applicant's disclosure of the dismissed charge is a critical piece of information that must be evaluated against the specific criteria outlined in New Hampshire law for firearm licensing. Correct approach involves a thorough review of the dismissed charge and the applicant's overall background to determine if it disqualifies them under New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated RSA 159-6, which outlines the grounds for denial of a pistol/revolver license. Specifically, RSA 159-6 IA prohibits licensing individuals convicted of certain crimes. A dismissed charge, while not a conviction, may still be considered by the licensing authority in conjunction with other factors. The licensing authority must assess whether the circumstances surrounding the arrest and dismissal indicate a propensity for violence or a disregard for the law that would render the applicant a danger to themselves or others, as per the spirit of RSA 159-6. This requires a nuanced understanding of the law and a commitment to fair, individualized assessment. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the license solely because an arrest occurred, regardless of its dismissal. This fails to acknowledge the legal distinction between an arrest and a conviction, and the principle that individuals should not be penalized for charges that did not result in a finding of guilt. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the dismissed charge altogether, assuming that a dismissal automatically clears the applicant. This would be a failure to conduct a comprehensive background review as mandated by the licensing process, and could potentially compromise public safety if the circumstances of the arrest were indicative of a disqualifying trait. Finally, An approach that relies on personal bias or assumptions about the applicant based on the arrest, rather than a factual and legal assessment, is also professionally unacceptable and violates the principles of due process and equal treatment under the law. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a comprehensive review of all submitted documentation, a thorough understanding of the relevant New Hampshire statutes, particularly RSA 159(6), and an objective evaluation of the applicant's history. This framework should include considering the nature of the charge, the reasons for dismissal, and any other information that might bear on the applicant's suitability to possess a firearm. The ultimate decision must be grounded in the law and applied consistently and fairly. Question 15. The audit findings indicate that a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license application was approved based on a valid license from another state, but without direct confirmation of the applicant's eligibility under New Hampshire law from the issuing authority of that other state. Which of the following actions represents the most appropriate response to this finding? Option A. Assume that a valid license from another state automatically meets all New Hampshire eligibility requirements for a non-resident pistol/revolver license. Option B. Initiate a direct inquiry with the issuing authority of the applicant's home state to verify the validity of their pistol/revolver license and confirm there are no disqualifying factors under New Hampshire law. Option C. Request a notarized affidavit from the applicant stating they are not disqualified from possessing a firearm under New Hampshire law, in addition to their out-of-state license. Option D. Accept the applicant's assertion that their out-of-state license confirms their eligibility for a New Hampshire non-resident license. The correct answer is B. Initiate a direct inquiry with the issuing authority of the applicant's home state to verify the validity of their pistol/revolver license and confirm there are no disqualifying factors under New Hampshire law. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential lapse in the proper verification of out-of-state applicant information for New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver licenses. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a meticulous adherence to New Hampshire's specific licensing statutes and administrative rules, balancing the need for efficient processing with the imperative of public safety and legal compliance. A failure to accurately verify an applicant's eligibility under New Hampshire law, even if they possess a license from another state, can have serious legal ramifications and compromise the integrity of the licensing system. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the applicant's out-of-state license and any accompanying documentation to ensure it meets the criteria established by New Hampshire RSA 159(6), which governs the issuance of pistol and revolver licenses. This includes verifying that the applicant is not prohibited from possessing a firearm under federal or state law, and that the out-of-state license is valid and issued by a jurisdiction with comparable licensing standards. The New Hampshire State Police, as the issuing authority, has a statutory duty to ensure all licensees meet the qualifications. Therefore, directly contacting the issuing authority in the applicant's home state to confirm the validity of their license and to inquire about any disqualifying factors is the most prudent and legally sound course of action. This proactive verification directly addresses the requirements of RSA 159(6) and ensures compliance with the state's commitment to responsible firearm licensing. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a valid license from another state automatically satisfies New Hampshire's requirements without further inquiry. This overlooks the possibility that the applicant might be disqualified under New Hampshire law for reasons not apparent on their out-of-state license or not considered by the issuing state. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the applicant's self-attestation of eligibility without independent verification. This bypasses the due diligence expected of the licensing authority and creates a significant risk of issuing a license to an ineligible individual, violating the spirit and letter of RSA 159(6). Finally, accepting a photocopy of the out-of-state license without attempting to confirm its authenticity or validity with the issuing agency is also professionally deficient, as it fails to establish a reliable basis for granting a New Hampshire license. Professionals in this role should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes statutory compliance and public safety. This involves 1. Understanding the specific requirements of New Hampshire RSA 159(6) and related administrative rules. 2. implementing a robust verification process for all out-of-state applicants, including direct contact with issuing authorities when necessary. 3. Documenting all verification steps taken. 4. Consulting with legal counsel or supervisors when encountering ambiguous situations or potential disqualifications. This systematic approach ensures that licensing decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with the state's legal obligations. Question 16. Compliance review shows that an applicant for a New Hampshire non-resident pistol/revolver license has prior convictions from another state. The applicant states that these convictions are not for offenses that are explicitly listed in New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA 159-3 as disqualifying. What is the most appropriate course of action for the licensing authority? Option A. Approve the license, assuming that any conviction not explicitly listed in RSA 159-3 is permissible for licensing purposes. Option B. Approve the license based on the applicant's self-declaration that their convictions are not disqualifying under New Hampshire law, without further verification. Option C. Thoroughly research the nature of the out-of-state convictions to determine if they are equivalent to offenses that would disqualify an applicant under New Hampshire RSA 159-3 and deny the application if they are equivalent. Option D. Approve the license automatically, as the applicant's convictions occurred out of state and are not explicitly listed in RSA 159-3. The correct answer is C. Thoroughly research the nature of the out-of-state convictions to determine if they are equivalent to offenses that would disqualify an applicant under New Hampshire RSA 159-3 and deny the application if they are equivalent. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves interpreting and applying New Hampshire's specific regulations for non-resident pistol/revolver licenses, particularly concerning the applicant's prior out-of-state convictions. The challenge lies in accurately assessing whether these convictions disqualify the applicant under New Hampshire law, which requires careful attention to detail and a thorough understanding of the relevant statutes. Misinterpreting these laws could lead to the issuance of a license to an individual who is legally prohibited from possessing one, posing a significant public safety risk and violating regulatory compliance. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a direct and thorough review of New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA 159, specifically focusing on RSA 159-3, which outlines the qualifications for a pistol or revolver license. This approach requires cross-referencing the applicant's out-of-state convictions with the disqualifying offenses listed in RSA 159-3. If the out-of-state convictions are equivalent to or fall under the categories of prohibited persons as defined by New Hampshire law, e.g., felony convictions, certain misdemeanor domestic violence convictions, the application must be denied. This approach is correct because it adheres strictly to the statutory requirements for licensing, ensuring that only eligible individuals receive a license and upholding public safety mandates. Incorrect approach is analysis. Approving the license based solely on the fact that the convictions occurred out of state, without verifying their equivalency to New Hampshire disqualifiers, is a regulatory failure. New Hampshire law does not automatically exempt individuals from disqualification due to out-of-state convictions. Rather, it requires an assessment of whether those convictions would disqualify them if they had occurred within New Hampshire. Granting the license based on a presumption of ineligibility for out-of-state offenses, without due diligence, bypasses the protective intent of RSA 159-3. Similarly, approving the license by assuming that any conviction not explicitly listed in RSA 159-3 as a disqualifier is permissible, without considering the broader categories of prohibited persons, such as those convicted of felonies, is also a regulatory failure. The statute's intent is to prevent individuals who pose a risk from obtaining a license, and this requires a comprehensive interpretation of disqualifying offenses. Relying on an applicant's self-declaration of eligibility without independent verification of their criminal history against New Hampshire's disqualification criteria is a significant lapse in due diligence and a violation of the licensing authority's responsibility. Professional reasoning. Professionals tasked with reviewing non-resident pistol/revolver license applications in New Hampshire should employ a systematic decision-making framework. This framework begins with a thorough understanding of RSA 159 and its specific provisions regarding disqualifications. When reviewing an application with out-of-state convictions, the primary step is to identify the nature of those convictions, and then meticulously compare them against the disqualifying criteria outlined in RSA 159(3). This involves researching the equivalent New Hampshire offenses for the applicant's out-of-state convictions. If the convictions align with any disqualifying offense, the application must be denied. If there is ambiguity, seeking clarification from legal counsel or the relevant state agency responsible for firearms licensing is advisable. The overarching principle is to prioritize public safety and strict adherence to the law over convenience or assumptions. Question 17. The evaluation methodology shows that when reviewing a non-resident pistol/revolver license application for New Hampshire, what is the most critical step to ensure compliance with the New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA, Chapter 159? Option A. Expedite the approval process by assuming the applicant has met the firearms safety training requirement without requiring proof or verification of equivalency. Option B. Accept the applicant's self-declaration of New Hampshire residency and provide a New Hampshire mailing address as sufficient proof of residency. Option C. Deny the application if there are any unverified rumors or suspicions about the applicant's character, even without concrete evidence of disqualification. Option D. Thoroughly verify the applicant's submitted documentation to confirm they meet all residency, age, and disqualification criteria as explicitly defined in RSA 159(4) and RSA 159(3), and that all required fees and training certifications are present. Correct answer is D. Thoroughly verify the applicant's submitted documentation to confirm they meet all residency, age, and disqualification criteria as explicitly defined in RSA 159(4) and RSA 159(3), and that all required fees and training certifications are present. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that processing a non-resident pistol/revolver license application in New Hampshire requires a meticulous adherence to specific statutory requirements and a thorough vetting process. The professional challenge lies in balancing the applicant's right to apply with the state's compelling interest in public safety and responsible firearm ownership. Misinterpreting or overlooking any detail can lead to either the improper issuance of a license to an unsuitable individual or the unjust denial of a legitimate applicant's rights. This scenario demands a decision-making framework that prioritizes accuracy, due diligence, and strict compliance with New Hampshire Revised Statutes Annotated, RSA, Chapter 159. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of all submitted documentation against the explicit criteria outlined in RSA 159(4). This includes verifying the applicant's residency status through submitted proof, confirming they meet the age requirement, 21 years or older, and ensuring they are not disqualified by any of the prohibitions listed in RSA 159(3), such as being a convicted felon, having a history of certain mental health adjudications, or being subject to a restraining order. The application must also be accompanied by the required fee and a photograph. This thorough, step-by-step verification process is mandated by New Hampshire law to ensure only qualified individuals receive a license, thereby upholding public safety. An incorrect approach would be to approve the application solely based on the applicant stating they are a New Hampshire resident and providing a New Hampshire mailing address, without independently verifying this through the submitted documentation. This fails to meet the statutory requirement for establishing residency and opens the door to potential misrepresentation, violating the spirit and letter of RSA 159(4). Another incorrect approach would be to deny the application based on a rumor or unsubstantiated information about the applicant's character, without any concrete evidence or legal basis for disqualification as defined in RSA 159(3). This constitutes an arbitrary and capricious denial, which is ethically and legally unacceptable and could lead to legal challenges. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to expedite the process and approve the license without confirming the applicant has completed the required safety training or its equivalent as stipulated by RSA 159(4), Roman 2. While the statute allows for equivalencies, a proper determination of such equivalency must be made, not assumed. Failing to do so undermines the intent of the training requirement to promote safe firearm handling. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the governing statutes, RSA Chapter 159. This framework should involve a checklist approach to ensure all statutory requirements are addressed for every application. It necessitates a commitment to verifying information independently, seeking clarification when ambiguities arise, and documenting all decisions and the rationale behind them. When in doubt, consulting with legal counsel or a supervisor experienced in firearm licensing is a prudent step to ensure compliance and uphold ethical standards. Question 18. Cost-benefit analysis shows that while obtaining a non-resident pistol/revolver license in New Hampshire involves some administrative effort, the benefits of legal firearm ownership are significant. Considering the specific requirements for non-residents under New Hampshire law, which of the following actions best represents a compliant and ethically sound approach for an applicant who primarily resides in Vermont but owns a vacation property in New Hampshire? Option A. The applicant submits an application for a New Hampshire pistol/revolver license, listing their New Hampshire vacation property address as their primary residence, and omits any mention of their Vermont residency. Option B. The applicant provides a completed application form, but omits the documentation proving their residency in a state that issues pistol permits, assuming their New Hampshire property ownership is sufficient. Option C. The applicant meticulously gathers all required documentation, including proof of their Vermont residency, and that Vermont issues pistol permits, along with evidence of their New Hampshire property ownership, and submits a complete application for a non-resident license. Option D. The applicant applies for a resident pistol/revolver license in New Hampshire, stating they are a resident based on their property ownership, and does not provide proof of their Vermont residency. The correct answer is C. The applicant meticulously gathers all required documentation, including proof of their Vermont residency, and that Vermont issues pistol permits, along with evidence of their New Hampshire property ownership, and submits a complete application for a non-resident license. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the specific requirements for obtaining a non-resident pistol/revolver license in New Hampshire, which involves understanding the interplay between federal law and state-specific regulations. The applicant must accurately represent their residency status and provide all necessary documentation without misrepresenting facts, as any inaccuracy could lead to denial and potential legal repercussions. Careful judgment is required to ensure full compliance with New Hampshire statutes. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves the applicant diligently gathering all required documentation as outlined by New Hampshire law for non-residents, including proof of non-residency in a state that issues pistol permits, a completed application form, and any other supporting documents mandated by the New Hampshire State Police. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the statutory requirements for obtaining a non-resident license, ensuring accuracy and completeness in the application process, thereby maximizing the likelihood of approval and avoiding any misrepresentation. Incorrect approach is analysis. Submitting an application that omits proof of non-residency in a permit-issuing state is an incorrect approach. This failure directly contravenes New Hampshire's specific requirements for non-resident applicants, as outlined in RSA 159(6), which mandates that a non-resident must be a resident of a state that issues pistol permits. Providing a New Hampshire address as their primary residence, even if they own property there, is also incorrect. This misrepresents their domicile and violates the spirit and letter of the non-resident licensing provisions, which are designed for individuals who reside elsewhere but seek a license in New Hampshire. Claiming to be a resident of New Hampshire for the purpose of obtaining a license while maintaining primary residency in another state is a form of misrepresentation that can lead to denial and potential penalties. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic approach to licensing applications. This involves thoroughly researching and understanding all applicable state and federal laws and regulations. For New Hampshire non-resident pistol licenses, this means consulting RSA 159 and any accompanying administrative rules. Applicants should then meticulously gather all required documentation, ensuring each piece accurately reflects their situation. If there is any ambiguity regarding requirements, seeking clarification from the issuing authority, New Hampshire State Police, is a prudent step. Honesty and accuracy in all representations are paramount to a successful and lawful application. Question 19. Implementation of a New Hampshire residence application for a Massachusetts non-resident pistol/revolver license requires careful consideration of disclosure requirements. The applicant had a prior arrest in New Hampshire for simple assault, which was subsequently dismissed by the court. They also have a prior conviction in New Hampshire for a misdemeanor traffic violation. When completing the Massachusetts application, which requires disclosure of all arrests and convictions, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Disclose only the misdemeanor traffic violation conviction, as the simple assault arrest was dismissed and therefore not a conviction. Option B. Disclose both the New Hampshire arrest for simple assault even though dismissed and the misdemeanor traffic violation conviction. Option C. Disclose only the New Hampshire arrest for simple assault, assuming Massachusetts will have access to their records and can determine relevance. Option D. Contact the New Hampshire State Police for guidance on what information Massachusetts requires for non-resident licenses. The correct answer is B. Disclose both the New Hampshire arrest for simple assault, even though dismissed, and the misdemeanor traffic violation conviction. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge for a New Hampshire resident seeking to obtain a non-resident pistol/revolver license in Massachusetts. The core difficulty lies in navigating the differing requirements and application processes between the two states, particularly concerning the disclosure of past legal issues. Massachusetts has stringent firearm licensing laws, and any misrepresentation or omission on the application can lead to denial and potential legal repercussions. Careful judgment is required to ensure full compliance with Massachusetts general laws, Chapter 140, Sections 129B and 131, which govern firearm permits. The best professional approach involves proactively and truthfully disclosing all relevant information to the Massachusetts licensing authority, even if it seems minor or was resolved favorably in New Hampshire. This includes any prior arrests, charges, or convictions, regardless of whether they resulted in a conviction or were expunged under New Hampshire law. Massachusetts law requires disclosure of all such incidents on the application for a firearm license. This approach ensures transparency and adherence to the Massachusetts Firearms Records Bureau's requirements and the legal mandate to provide accurate information. It demonstrates respect for the licensing process and the seriousness with which Massachusetts treats firearm ownership. An incorrect approach would be to only disclose the arrest that resulted in a conviction in New Hampshire, believing that issues resolved without a conviction are not relevant. This fails to meet the Massachusetts requirement for full disclosure of all arrests and charges, regardless of outcome. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because the applicant is a New Hampshire resident, New Hampshire's disclosure standards apply. This ignores the fact that the license is being sought in Massachusetts, and therefore Massachusetts law governs the application process. Finally, attempting to contact the New Hampshire authorities for guidance on what to disclose to Massachusetts is an indirect and potentially ineffective method, as New Hampshire officials are not privy to Massachusetts' specific disclosure mandates for their licensing process. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes thorough research of the target jurisdiction's specific laws and regulations. This involves consulting official government websites, relevant statutes, and, if necessary, seeking advice from legal counsel specializing in firearm law in the target state. The framework should emphasize honesty and completeness in all applications, recognizing that any attempt to conceal or misrepresent information can have severe consequences. Question 20. To address the challenge of accurately calculating a client's potential New Hampshire tax liability on investment income as a non-resident, a financial advisor is presented with the following scenario. The client, a resident of Vermont, holds a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds in a brokerage account managed by a firm located in Massachusetts. The client has no real estate or business interests in New Hampshire. The total annual dividends and capital gains from this portfolio are projected to be $25,000. If the New Hampshire tax rate on investment income for non-residents is 5%, what is the projected New Hampshire tax liability on this investment income? Option A. $625, representing 5% of half of the projected investment income, assuming a 50% taxable portion. Option B. $1 250, representing 5% of the total projected investment income of $25,000. Option C, $250, representing 5% of $5,000, assuming a portion of the income is taxable. Option D, $0, as investment income from intangible assets held outside New Hampshire by a non-resident is not taxable in New Hampshire. The correct answer is D, $0, as investment income from intangible assets held outside New Hampshire by a non-resident is not taxable in New Hampshire. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a financial advisor to accurately calculate the potential tax implications of a client's investment strategy while adhering to specific New Hampshire state tax laws for non-residents. Miscalculation can lead to significant financial penalties for the client and damage the advisor's reputation and professional standing. The advisor must navigate the nuances of New Hampshire's tax treatment of investment income for individuals who are not residents of the state, ensuring compliance with RSA 77A and related statutes. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a precise calculation of the client's projected investment income that is taxable in New Hampshire. This requires identifying all income sources that would be considered New Hampshire source income for a non-resident, such as income from tangible property located within New Hampshire or income derived from a business, trade, or profession conducted within the state. For investment income, New Hampshire generally taxes income derived from tangible property located within the state. If the client's investments are solely in intangible assets, like stocks and bonds held by a brokerage outside New Hampshire, and the client does not conduct business in New Hampshire, then the income generated from these investments would typically not be subject to New Hampshire income tax for a non-resident. The advisor must apply the New Hampshire tax rate to the New Hampshire-sourced portion of the investment income. For example, if the client has $10,000 in dividends from stocks held in a brokerage account outside New Hampshire and no other New Hampshire-sourced income, the taxable amount in New Hampshire would be $0. If, however, the client owned rental property in New Hampshire generating $5,000 in net rental income, that $5,000 would be New Hampshire source income. The advisor must then apply the relevant New Hampshire tax rate, currently 5% for most income types under RSA 77A, 4, to the New Hampshire sourced income. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply apply the New Hampshire tax rate to the client's total investment income without considering the source of that income. This fails to recognize that New Hampshire, like many states, only taxes income that has a sufficient connection to the state. Applying the tax to income not sourced in New Hampshire would be an overpayment of taxes and a violation of tax law principles. Another incorrect approach is to assume that all investment income is taxable in New Hampshire for a non-resident. This overlooks the specific rules regarding sourcing of income for non-residents, which are crucial for accurate tax liability determination. This approach could lead to unnecessary tax burdens and potential disputes with tax authorities. A third incorrect approach is to ignore the potential for New Hampshire tax liability altogether, assuming that because the client is a non-resident, no New Hampshire taxes apply to any investment income. This is a dangerous assumption, as certain types of income, particularly those derived from tangible property or business activities within the state, are indeed taxable. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach to tax calculations for non-residents. This involves 1. Clearly identifying the client's residency status and the relevant tax jurisdiction's laws. 2. Thoroughly understanding the nature of the client's income streams, distinguishing between different types of income, e.g., wages, business income, investment income, rental income. 3. For investment income, meticulously determining the source of that income according to the specific state's regulations. 4. Applying the correct tax rates and deductions as stipulated by the relevant tax code. 5. Documenting all calculations and the basis for their conclusions to ensure transparency and audit readiness.